My name is Rebecca Hayes. I'm 41 years old, and I spent 19 years wearing the uniform of the United States Army. I've led soldiers through the deserts of Iraq, commanded operations in the mountains of Afghanistan, and earned every stripe, every ribbon, every commendation through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the moment I stood outside the Cedar Falls Community Center on a cold November morning, watching strangers file into my own father's memorial service while his widow pretended I didn't exist. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The parking lot was packed with cars I didn't recognize. Veterans in dress uniforms walked past me without acknowledgement, their faces solemn as they headed toward the entrance. I clutched the folded program in my hand, the one I'd printed from the online obituary, because apparently that was the only way I could learn the details of my own father's final farewell. Colonel William Hayes, the program read, beloved husband, father, and patriot. But as I scanned the listed family members, my name was nowhere to be found. I stood there in my dress blues, the same uniform I'd worn to accept my final promotion just 2 years earlier, feeling more invisible than I'd ever felt in any combat zone. The autumn wind cut through the Ohio air, carrying with it the distant sound of a bugle warming up somewhere inside the building. That's when I saw him walking toward the entrance, an elderly man with a slight limp, wearing a uniform decorated with ribbons I recognized from a different war, a different time. His silver hair was perfectly groomed beneath his garrison cap, and something about the way he carried himself made my breath catch in my throat. He paused at the entrance, scanning the crowd, and for just a moment, his eyes met mine across the parking lot. There was recognition there, something deeper than curiosity, and he began walking in my direction with the measured pace of a man who had spent his life in service. I didn't know it then, but that moment would change everything. The story begins 6 months earlier, when I received the phone call that shattered my world into a million pieces. I was in my small apartment in Portland, Oregon, grading papers for the Veteran Transition Program where I'd been volunteering since my retirement. The rain was drumming against the windows, creating that familiar Pacific Northwest rhythm that had become my new normal after leaving the structured chaos of military life. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and completely unfamiliar. This is Cedar Falls General Hospital. We're calling regarding Colonel William Hayes. He's been admitted with complications from pneumonia, and he's asking for Rebecca. I dropped the pen I'd been holding, my hand suddenly too unsteady to maintain its grip. My father had been fighting a respiratory condition for months, something Linda had mentioned briefly in one of her infrequent text messages, but she'd always downplayed its severity. I was on the next flight to Ohio, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. Fear that I might be too late, and hope that maybe finally, my father and I could bridge the distance that had grown between us since his remarriage to Linda 8 years earlier. The flight felt endless, every minute stretching like an hour as I replayed our last conversation in my mind. It had been stilted, formal, interrupted by Linda's voice in the background reminding him about some appointment or obligation. When I arrived at the hospital, the antiseptic smell hit me immediately, that unique combination of cleaning supplies and barely contained human suffering that exists in every medical facility I'd ever entered. I found his room at the information desk and made my way through corridors that seemed to stretch forever, my footsteps echoing against the polished linoleum floors. He was smaller than I remembered, diminished somehow by the hospital bed and the maze of tubes and wires surrounding him. But his eyes were alert when I entered, and they lit up with a warmth I hadn't seen in years. "Becca," he whispered, his voice hoarse but filled with genuine joy. "You came." I pulled a chair close to his bedside and took his hand, noting how fragile it felt, how different from the strong, calloused hands that had taught me to tie my shoes and throw a baseball. We talked for hours that first day, really talked in a way we hadn't since I was a teenager. He told me stories about Vietnam that he'd never shared before, about the friends he'd lost and the weight he'd carried home. I told him about my deployments, about the soldiers I'd led and the decisions that still kept me awake some nights. For the first time in years I felt like I had my father back. Linda arrived in the evening, bringing Tyler and Amber with her. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees the moment they walked through the door. Linda's smile was plastic, brittle, as she kissed my father's forehead and asked how he was feeling. Tyler, now 28 and still living at home, barely acknowledged my presence, while Amber, 25 and clearly uncomfortable with the family tension, offered a hesitant wave. I could see the way Linda's jaw tightened when she noticed how animated my father became when talking to me. She made pointed comments about not overwhelming him, about how he needed his rest, and suggested perhaps I should consider returning to Portland since my work was surely waiting for me. My father's eyes flashed with something I hadn't seen in years, a spark of the man who had once stood up to drill sergeants in hostile fire. "Rebecca is my daughter," he said quietly but firmly. She stays as long as she wants to stay. Linda's smile faltered for just a moment, revealing something harder underneath, something that made my stomach clench with unease. Of course, she replied sweetly. We're all family here. I spent the next week dividing my time between the hospital and a nearby hotel, unwilling to accept Linda's grudging invitation to stay at the family home on Maple Street. Each day, my father grew a little weaker, but our conversations grew deeper, more meaningful. He told me about the hardware store he'd built from nothing, about the pride he felt watching me excel in my military career, and about the regrets he carried regarding the distance that had grown between us. One afternoon, while Linda was out handling some business arrangements, my father gripped my hand with surprising strength. Becca, he said, his voice urgent despite its weakness, there are things you need to know, things about the store, about my will, about what I want for you. But before he could continue, Linda returned with a nurse in tow, insisting it was time for his medication and that visitors should give him space to rest. I watched helplessly as my father's eyes closed, the medication pulling him into sleep before he could finish what he'd been trying to tell me. Linda bustled around the room, adjusting flowers and speaking in hushed tones with the nurse about care instructions and visiting schedules. There was something in her efficiency, her careful management of every detail, that made me deeply uncomfortable. That evening, I called my old Army friend Marcus Chen, who had retired to Cincinnati and had been my rock through many of life's challenges. Marcus had a way of cutting through emotional confusion with clear, practical thinking, a skill that had served us both well during our years of service together. I need an outside perspective, I told him, describing the tension I was feeling and the incomplete conversation with my father. Marcus listened without interruption, then asked pointed questions about Linda's behavior, about the family dynamics, and about my father's business affairs. Trust your instincts, Becca, he said finally. You've been in enough dangerous situations to recognize when something doesn't feel right. Maybe it's time to do some reconnaissance. The next morning, I arrived at the hospital early, hoping to continue the conversation with my father before the daily parade of visitors and medical staff began. But when I entered his room, something had changed. He was awake but seemed confused, disoriented in a way that hadn't been present the day before. When I spoke to him, he looked at me with genuine puzzlement, as though he couldn't quite place who I was. The doctor explained that this was common with his condition, that the medication and the progression of his illness could cause periods of confusion, but something about the timing, about the abrupt change from our meaningful conversation to this sudden disorientation, felt wrong. I spent the day beside his bed anyway, holding his hand and talking quietly about shared memories, hoping to reach whatever part of him might still be listening. Linda arrived in the afternoon with a folder full of documents and a serious expression. She explained that she'd been meeting with lawyers and financial advisors, making sure everything was in order for whatever might come. The way she phrased it, with that careful euphemism, made it clear she didn't expect my father to recover. Part of me wanted to argue, to insist that he was stronger than they realized, but the rational part of my mind recognized that she was probably right. Over the next few days, my father drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes recognizing me, sometimes staring through me as though I were a stranger. Linda and her children maintained a constant presence, creating a buffer that made private conversations impossible. I began to feel like an intruder in my own father's final moments, an unwelcome guest whose presence was merely tolerated. It was during one of these difficult days that I noticed something that would haunt me for months afterward. Linda was speaking quietly with Tyler near the window, their voices low but their body language tense. I caught fragments of their conversation, mentions of timing and paperwork, and the need to move quickly on certain matters. When they noticed me listening, they immediately changed the subject to something mundane about funeral arrangements. My father passed away on a Tuesday morning in March, slipping away peacefully in his sleep, while I was back at my hotel room trying to catch a few hours of rest. Linda called to inform me, her voice carefully controlled, explaining that it had happened very suddenly and that there had been no time to call me before it was over. I rushed to the hospital anyway, hoping for one last moment with him, but his room was already being cleaned and prepared for the next patient. The funeral arrangements moved forward with military precision, organized entirely by Linda and her children. I was consulted on nothing, informed of decisions after they had already been made, treated more like a distant relative than a daughter. The service was scheduled for the following Saturday at Cedar Falls Community Center, with burial afterward at the Veterans section of Woodland Cemetery. I stayed in Ohio for the funeral, despite Linda's repeated suggestions that I might be more comfortable making arrangements to return to Portland. Something in her eagerness to see me gone made me determined to stay, to honor my father's memory regardless of how unwelcome my presence seemed to be. I spent the week leading up to the funeral walking through downtown Cedar Falls, visiting the hardware store my father had built and sold just 2 years earlier, trying to piece together the life he'd lived after I'd left for my military career. The town had changed since my childhood, grown and modernized in ways that made it feel both familiar and foreign. But the Veterans Memorial Park in the center of town remained exactly as I remembered it, with its bronze statue of a World War II soldier and the granite walls inscribed with names of local heroes who had served and sacrificed. My father's name would be added to those walls, Linda had mentioned, once the proper paperwork was completed. Standing in that park surrounded by the evidence of my father's place in the community he'd served and loved, I felt the full weight of my loss, not just of him, but of my connection to this place that had shaped both of us. I was a stranger here now, an outsider looking in on a life and legacy that should have been partly mine to claim and preserve. The night before the funeral, I sat in my hotel room polishing my dress blues and preparing for what I expected would be a difficult but meaningful goodbye. I had prepared remarks, memories I wanted to share about the man who had taught me the values of duty and service that had guided my entire adult life. I had no idea that when morning came, I would discover that my name had been systematically erased from every aspect of my father's memorial, or that I would spend the service standing in a parking lot, excluded from my own father's final farewell. Looking back now, I can see the signs I missed.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The careful maneuvering that had been happening around me while I focused on grief and loss, but in that moment, preparing for what I thought would be my chance to honor my father and perhaps find some healing with his other family. I was simply a daughter trying to say goodbye to the man who had shaped everything I believed about honor, courage, and what it meant to serve something greater than yourself. The morning of my father's memorial service dawned gray and bitter, with the kind of November cold that seeps through your bones and settles there like an unwelcome guest. I had spent the night in restless sleep, waking every few hours to check the time, my mind racing through the speech I had prepared and the memories I wanted to share. By dawn I had given up on sleep entirely and stood at my hotel window, watching the sun struggle to break through the thick Ohio clouds. I dressed carefully in my army dress blues, each piece of the uniform carrying weight beyond its fabric. The ribbons on my chest told the story of 19 years of service, deployments to places most people couldn't pronounce, and moments when split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death for the soldiers under my command. As I adjusted my collar and checked my appearance one final time, I felt my father's presence somehow, remembering how proud he had looked the day I received my first promotion. The drive to the Cedar Falls Community Center should have been familiar. I had attended dozens of events there as a child, from school plays to town meetings to holiday celebrations, but as I pulled into the parking lot that morning, everything felt foreign and hostile. Cars filled every available space, and I had to park 3 blocks away, walking back through the November wind with my dress shoes clicking against the sidewalk. As I approached the building, I could see people streaming through the main entrance, many of them in uniform, others in dark suits and dresses appropriate for a military funeral. The sight should have been comforting, evidence of the respect my father commanded in his community, but instead, it filled me with a growing sense of unease. I didn't recognize most of the faces, and more importantly, none of them seemed to recognize me. At the entrance, a young woman with a clipboard and a forced smile was greeting attendees and handing out programs. When I approached, she looked at me with the polite confusion reserved for uninvited guests. "Good morning," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Are you here for the Hayes Memorial?" When I confirmed that I was, she consulted her clipboard with unnecessary intensity. "I don't see your name on the family list," she said, her smile growing more strained. "Are you a friend from the community or perhaps a fellow veteran?" The question hit me like a physical blow. "I'm Rebecca Hayes," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil building in my chest. "I'm his daughter." The young woman's eyes widened slightly, and she glanced nervously toward the interior of the building. "Oh," she stammered, "I'm so sorry, but I was told that all immediate family members were already seated. Perhaps there's been some confusion." She looked genuinely distressed, caught between conflicting information and an increasingly awkward situation. Before I could respond, Linda appeared at the entrance, resplendent in an elegant black dress, and looking every inch the grieving widow. Her expression when she saw me was carefully controlled, but I caught the flash of irritation that crossed her features before she composed herself. "Rebecca," she said, her voice carrying just enough volume to be heard by nearby attendees, "what a surprise to see you here. I thought you had returned to Portland." The deliberate nature of her words was clear to me, if not to the growing audience of onlookers. She was establishing a narrative, painting me as the distant daughter who hadn't been expected to attend her own father's memorial. I remained silent for a moment, processing the calculated cruelty of her performance while deciding how to respond without creating a scene that would dishonor my father's memory. "I live in Portland," I replied evenly, "but I'm here to honor my father." Linda's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in her eyes. "Of course," she said, her tone dripping with false warmth, "though I do hope you understand that the program has already been finalized, and we weren't expecting any additional speakers." The arrangements were made according to Bill's specific wishes, and we want to respect those exactly as he expressed them. The lie was delivered so smoothly, with such apparent sincerity, that I almost doubted my own memories of the conversations I'd had with my father during his final week. He had spoken repeatedly about his pride in my military service, about wanting people to understand the kind of daughter he had raised. The idea that he would have wanted me excluded from his memorial was not just unlikely, but impossible. Tyler appeared beside his mother, tall and lean in an ill-fitting black suit, his expression reflecting the same cold hostility I had come to expect from him over the years. He placed a protective hand on Linda's shoulder, and looked at me with undisguised antagonism. "Mom," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp air, "shouldn't we get inside? People are waiting, and I think we've kept them long enough." The dismissal was clear, and I felt the weight of the stares from other attendees who had paused to watch this family drama unfold. Some looked sympathetic, others merely curious, but all of them were now part of an audience I had never wanted to create. I stepped back from the entrance, my mind racing through options that seemed increasingly limited and unpalatable. That's when I noticed him, standing near the edge of the parking lot with his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that spoke of decades of military discipline. The elderly veteran I had glimpsed earlier was watching the scene unfold with sharp, intelligent eyes. His silver hair was perfectly groomed beneath his garrison cap, and the ribbons on his chest spoke of service in conflicts that predated my own by decades. There was something familiar about him, though I couldn't place where I might have seen him before. Linda followed my gaze, and her expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Jimmy Rodriguez was one of your father's oldest friends," she said, her voice carrying a warning tone. "He served with Bill in Vietnam, and he's been kind enough to help with some of the arrangements. I'm sure he understands how important it is to keep things simple and respectful today." The way she emphasized certain words made it clear that she considered the matter closed, that my presence was an unwelcome complication that needed to be managed rather than acknowledged. She turned to go back inside, pausing only to add, in a voice loud enough for nearby listeners, "Rebecca, there's a lovely coffee shop just down the street if you'd like somewhere quiet to remember your father." Sometimes private reflection can be more meaningful than public ceremony. The suggestion was delivered with such apparent kindness that anyone overhearing might have thought she was being considerate rather than cruel, but the message was unmistakable. I was not welcome at my own father's memorial service, and any attempt to assert my right to be there would be painted as disruptive and disrespectful. I stood there in the November cold, watching as the last stragglers made their way inside and the doors closed behind them. Through the windows, I could see people taking their seats, could hear the muffled sound of someone testing the microphone. Somewhere inside that building, my father's casket was draped with an American flag, surrounded by flowers and photographs, and all the symbols of a life well lived. And I was standing in a parking lot, excluded from the farewell as completely as if I had never existed. The elderly veteran, Jimmy Rodriguez, began walking in my direction with the measured pace of someone who had made a deliberate decision. His face was weathered in the way that speaks of decades spent outdoors, of hardships endured and overcome. When he reached me, he removed his garrison cap with old-fashioned courtesy and extended his hand. "Colonel Hayes," he said, his voice carrying the particular cadence of someone who had spent years giving and receiving orders. "Your father spoke of you often, and with tremendous pride. I served with Bill in Vietnam, and I want you to know that he never stopped talking about his daughter who followed in his footsteps." The use of my rank, delivered with genuine respect, nearly undid my composure. It had been months since anyone had addressed me with the title I had earned through years of dedication and sacrifice. In Linda's household, my military service was treated as an inconvenient fact, something to be acknowledged grudgingly if at all. But this man, this stranger who had known my father in ways I never would, recognized me for who I was and what I had accomplished. "He shouldn't have excluded you from this," Jimmy continued, his voice low but carrying absolute conviction. "Bill would be furious if he knew what was happening here today. Your service, your sacrifice, your relationship with him that means something, and it deserves to be honored alongside his memory." The validation was overwhelming, coming from someone who had no reason to lie or flatter me, but it also highlighted the impossible position I found myself in, standing outside while my father's life was being celebrated and remembered by people who barely knew him compared to the relationship we had shared. The injustice of it burned in my chest, but I couldn't see any way to assert my rights without creating exactly the kind of scene that would overshadow his memory. Through the windows, I could see the service beginning. A man in clerical robes had taken his position at the podium, and the assembled crowd had grown quiet and attentive. Linda sat in the front row, flanked by Tyler and Amber occupying the seats that should have included space for me. Behind them, rows of community members, veterans and family friends had gathered to pay their respects to a man they admired and respected. I watched as speaker after speaker took the podium, sharing memories and stories about my father's impact on their lives. Some I recognized from my childhood, Others were complete strangers who had clearly known him well in the years since I had left Cedar Falls. Each testimony painted a picture of a man who was generous, principled, and deeply committed to his community and fellow veterans. But the story being told was incomplete, missing the chapters that involved me and the relationship we had rebuilt during his final year. The narrative being constructed in that room was one of a man whose family consisted solely of his wife and her children, whose military legacy was honored but whose actual military daughter was erased from the record. The systematic nature of my exclusion was becoming more apparent with each passing moment. Jimmy Rodriguez remained beside me throughout this humiliating vigil, his presence a silent but powerful statement of solidarity. He didn't try to fill the silence with empty platitudes or suggest that I should simply accept the situation. Instead, he stood witness to an injustice that he clearly recognized and disapproved of, his very presence serving as a rebuke to the people inside who had chosen to erase me from my father's story. As the service progressed, I began to notice other veterans in the parking lot, men and women who had arrived late or stepped outside for air. Several of them nodded respectfully in my direction, and I caught fragments of conversations that suggested not everyone was comfortable with the arrangements that had been made. There were whispered questions about Bill's daughter, wondering why she wasn't part of the proceedings, expressing confusion about family dynamics they didn't understand. The temperature continued to drop as the morning wore on, and my dress blues, while impressive, were not designed for extended exposure to Ohio winter weather. My fingers began to numb despite my gloves, and I could feel the cold seeping through the soles of my dress shoes. But I remained in position, unwilling to leave until my father's service was complete, even if I had been denied the right to participate in it. Near what seemed to be the conclusion of the formal program, I saw movement through the windows that suggested people were beginning to prepare for the procession to the cemetery. This would be my last chance to be part of honoring my father, to follow his casket to its final resting place and stand among those who had loved and respected him. Surely, I thought, they couldn't exclude me from a public cemetery ceremony. But as the pallbearers emerged carrying my father's flag-draped casket, Linda appeared beside the hearse and began directing traffic with the efficiency of a logistics coordinator. She pointed various family members towards specific vehicles in the funeral procession, waving them into position with the authority of someone who had planned every detail. When she saw me standing with Jimmy Rodriguez, her expression hardened into something approaching hostility. "Rebecca," she called out, her voice carrying across the parking lot with calculated volume, "I hope you understand that the cemetery portion is really just for immediate family and closest friends. The space is quite limited, and we want to keep things intimate and manageable. I'm sure you can appreciate that." The words hit me like a slap, delivered with such public cruelty that several nearby veterans turned to stare in shock.
The implication was clear. I was not considered immediate family, despite being my father's biological daughter and a fellow veteran who had dedicated her life to the same values he had embodied. I was being excluded not just from the memorial service but from the burial itself, denied even the basic right to stand beside his grave as he was laid to rest. Jimmy Rodriguez stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded respect for decades. "Miss Hayes," he said, his tone carefully controlled but unmistakably firm, "I believe there may be some confusion here. Colonel Rebecca Hayes is Bill's daughter and a distinguished veteran in her own right. I'm certain that Bill would have wanted her present for all aspects of his funeral, including the burial." Linda's composure cracked slightly, revealing the steel underneath her polished exterior. "Jimmy," she replied, her voice sweet but edged with warning, "I appreciate your concern, but these arrangements were made according to Bill's specific wishes as expressed to his immediate family. I'm sure you understand that it would be inappropriate to change them now based on assumptions about what he might have wanted." The standoff between them was electric. Two strong-willed people representing completely different versions of what my father would have wanted for his final farewell. Around us, other attendees had begun loading into cars for the procession, but many had slowed their movements to watch this confrontation unfold. The tension was palpable, and I realized that whatever happened next would be witnessed and remembered by dozens of people who had known and respected my father. Jimmy Rodriguez straightened to his full height, every inch the decorated sergeant major he had once been. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying across the parking lot with unmistakable authority, "I served with Bill Hayes in some of the worst conditions imaginable. I know exactly what kind of man he was and what he valued most, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that he would be ashamed of what's happening here today." The words hung in the cold air like a physical presence, and I could see their impact on Linda's carefully constructed face. For just a moment, her mask slipped entirely, revealing something ugly and calculating underneath, but she recovered quickly, turning away from Jimmy with deliberate dismissal and beginning to walk toward the lead car in the procession. That's when something extraordinary happened. Jimmy Rodriguez removed his garrison cap, came to attention with parade ground precision, and rendered a perfect military salute in my direction. His voice, when he spoke, carried clearly across the parking lot, reaching every ear in the vicinity. "Colonel Hayes," he said, his words crisp and formal, "it has been an honor to serve alongside your father and to meet the daughter who carried on his legacy of service and sacrifice." He held the salute for a long moment, his weathered face grave with respect and recognition. The effect was immediate and electric. Every veteran in the parking lot stopped what they were doing and turned to look at me with new understanding. Several of them, recognizing the significance of the moment, removed their own caps and came to attention. Within moments, what had begun as a single gesture of respect had become something larger, a spontaneous demonstration of military solidarity that cut through Linda's carefully orchestrated narrative like a sword through silk. Standing there in the November cold, surrounded by veterans who had chosen to honor me despite the family that had tried to erase me, I felt something shift inside my chest. The pain was still there, the sense of loss and betrayal that would take much longer to heal, but alongside it, something stronger began to emerge. The knowledge that my father's true legacy lived, not in the carefully managed memorial service happening inside that building, but in the values he had passed on to me and the respect he had earned from people who understood what service really meant. The procession began to move without me, a line of black cars following the hearse toward Woodland Cemetery. But I was no longer standing alone in an empty parking lot. I was surrounded by men and women who had recognized something in me that my own family had chosen to ignore, who understood that blood relationships mean nothing without respect and honor to back them up. Jimmy Rodriguez replaced his cap and turned to face me with the same serious expression he had worn throughout this extraordinary morning. "Colonel," he said quietly, "there are things about your father you need to know, things that happened during his final weeks that might explain what's going on here today. If you're willing to listen, I think it's time someone told you the truth about what Bill really wanted for his memorial and for his family." The offer hung between us like a door opening onto possibilities I hadn't even imagined. Whatever Jimmy Rodriguez was about to tell me, I sensed it would change everything I thought I understood about my father's death, my family's betrayal, and the systematic erasure of my place in his life and legacy. The real story, it seemed, was only just beginning. Jimmy Rodriguez suggested we meet at Murphy's Diner on Main Street, a place that had been serving coffee and comfort food to Cedar Falls residents for over 40 years. As I followed his directions through the familiar streets of my childhood, I found myself noticing details that had escaped my attention during my recent visit. The town had grown more prosperous in recent years, with new businesses filling storefronts that had stood empty when I was young, but there was something artificial about the progress, as if the community was trying too hard to reinvent itself. Murphy's Diner looked exactly as I remembered it, down to the red vinyl booths and the black and white checkered floor that had probably been installed sometime in the lunch crowd was just beginning to thin out when I arrived, and I spotted Jimmy immediately in a corner booth, already nursing a cup of coffee and studying a manila folder that lay open on the table in front of him. He stood when I approached, extending his hand with the same military courtesy he had shown in the parking lot. His face looked older in the fluorescent lighting of the diner, more worn by whatever burdens he had been carrying since my father's death. When we settled into the booth, he closed the folder carefully and looked at me with an expression that was equal parts sympathy and determination. "Your father came to see me about 3 weeks before he died," Jimmy began, his voice low enough that our conversation wouldn't carry to neighboring tables. "He was worried about some things, concerned about what might happen after he was gone. Bill wasn't the type to share family business lightly, but he was troubled enough to seek out an old friend's advice." The waitress appeared at our table, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes who seemed to recognize Jimmy as a regular customer. She poured coffee for both of us without being asked and left a small plate of cookies that looked homemade. Jimmy waited until she had moved on to other tables before continuing his story. "Bill told me that Linda had been pressuring him to make changes to his will, to simplify things by leaving everything to her and her children. She argued that since you lived so far away and had your own career, you didn't need the complications of managing property or business interests in Ohio. On the surface it seemed reasonable, even considerate. But your father wasn't buying it." I wrapped my hands around the warm coffee mug, feeling the heat seep through my palms as I processed this information. My father had always been shrewd about business and people, qualities that had served him well in both military and civilian life. The idea that he would be easily manipulated seemed unlikely, but I also knew that grief and illness could make even strong people vulnerable to influence. "What troubled Bill the most," Jimmy continued, was that Linda seemed to know things about his financial situation that he hadn't shared with her. She mentioned specific accounts, investments he had made years before they were married, property values that weren't public knowledge. When he asked her where she had gotten this information, she claimed it was just general knowledge from living in the community for so many years. The implications of what Jimmy was describing began to settle in my mind like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't realized I was trying to solve. During my father's final illness, Linda had been present for every medical appointment, every conversation with doctors, every decision about his care. She had controlled access to him with the efficiency of a military checkpoint, always with plausible explanations about his need for rest or the importance of not overwhelming him with too many visitors. Jimmy opened the manila folder and withdrew a small digital recorder, the kind that was popular with journalists and students. "Your father asked me to hold on to this," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of secret. He recorded it during one of Linda's visits to the hospital, when she thought he was asleep after his medication. He wanted someone to have proof of what was really happening, in case things went the way he suspected they might. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the recorder, remembering the incomplete conversation my father had tried to have with me about his will and his wishes for my future. I had assumed at the time that his urgency was simply the result of facing his own mortality, the natural desire to ensure his affairs were in order. But if Jimmy was right, there had been more specific threats my father was trying to protect against. "Before you listen to this," Jimmy said, his expression grave, "you need to understand what your father was dealing with." Linda had convinced him to give her power of attorney over his medical decisions, claiming it would simplify things if he became unable to communicate his wish. She used that authority to control his medication schedule, his visitor access, even the information his doctors received about his condition. The betrayal of trust Jimmy was describing was staggering in its calculation and cruel. I thought about the confusion my father had displayed during my final visits, the way his mental clarity seemed to fluctuate unpredictably. At the time I had attributed it to the natural progression of his illness, but now I wondered if there had been more deliberate factors at work. Jimmy pressed play on the recorder, and my father's voice filled the small space between us, weak but unmistakably angry. The recording was clearly made in secret, with the slight electronic hiss that comes from a device hidden beneath clothing or bedding. But every word was audible, and what I heard made my blood run cold. Linda's voice, speaking in the soothing tones she used when she thought she was being caring and considerate, was explaining to someone on the phone why certain arrangements needed to be made quickly. She mentioned that Bill's condition was deteriorating faster than expected, which was fortunate because it would simplify some of the timeline issues they had been discussing. She talked about memorial service planning as if it were a business transaction, emphasizing the importance of controlling the narrative and managing family dynamics. But the most damning part of the recording came when Linda began discussing me specifically. She told whoever was on the other end of the call that Rebecca had always been a problem, too independent and military-minded to understand family responsibility. She said that Bill's attachment to his daughter was nostalgic nonsense, based on outdated notions of military honor that had no place in modern family planning. She assured the listener that once Bill was gone, there would be no need to consider Rebecca's opinions or wishes about anything related to the family legacy. The recording continued for nearly 20 minutes, revealing a level of manipulation and calculation that went far beyond anything I had imagined. Linda discussed specific strategies for isolating me from the funeral planning process, ways to frame my absence as voluntary rather than imposed. She talked about the importance of presenting a united family front to the community, one that didn't include complications from stepchildren who might have different ideas about honoring Bill's memory. When the recording finally ended, I sat in stunned silence, trying to process the implications of what I had just heard. The systematic exclusion I had experienced wasn't the result of grief-driven family tension or simple oversight. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to erase me from my father's story and ensure that Linda's version of events became the official record. Jimmy reached across the table and placed his weathered hand over mine, his touch grounding me in the present moment. "Your father was lucid when he made this recording," he said quietly. "He knew exactly what was happening, and he was furious about it. But he was also scared, Rebecca. He was afraid that if he confronted Linda directly, she might find ways to prevent him from seeing you at all during his final day." The cruel irony of the situation was overwhelming. My father had endured Linda's manipulation and control because he was trying to protect the small amount of time we had left together. He had sacrificed his own peace of mind to ensure that I could be with him during his final illness, never knowing that his sacrifice would ultimately be meaningless because Linda would exclude me from his memorial anyway. But Jimmy wasn't finished with his revelation. He withdrew another document from the folder, this one bearing the letterhead of a law firm I didn't recognize. "This is a copy of your father's original will," he said. "The one he filed 2 years ago, before Linda began pressuring him to make changes. He wanted me to have it in case questions ever arose about his true intentions." I scanned the document quickly, my eyes focusing on the sections that pertained to me. My father had left me not just sentimental items or a small inheritance, but a substantial portion of his estate, including the hardware store he had built from nothing, and several pieces of property that had been in our family for generations. More importantly, he had designated me as the executor of his will, responsible for ensuring that his final wishes were carried out exactly as he had specified. The will also contained detailed instructions for his funeral and memorial service, specifying that he wanted military honors and asking that I be given the opportunity to speak about his service and his impact on my own military career. He had requested that the ceremony emphasize his pride in having raised a daughter who had followed in his footsteps, who had taken the values he had taught her and used them to serve her country with distinction. None of these wishes had been honored. Instead, Linda had somehow managed to substitute a different version of his will, one that presumably gave her complete control over his estate and his funeral arrangement. The document Jimmy had shown me was dated and notarized, with all the legal requirements for validity, but clearly it had been superseded by something else, something that had eliminated my role entirely. Jimmy watched my face as I absorbed the implications of what he was showing me, his expression reflecting the same anger and frustration I was beginning to feel. "Your father suspected that Linda might try something like this. That's why he asked me to hold on to these documents, to serve as a witness to his real intentions if the need ever arose. He also asked me to give you something else." From the bottom of the folder, Jimmy withdrew a letter in my father's handwriting, my name written on the envelope in the careful script I remembered from birthday cards and military care packages. The envelope was sealed, and I could feel the weight of several pages inside. Jimmy handed it to me with the same reverence he might have shown a flag being presented to a grieving widow. "He wrote this during his last week in the hospital," Jimmy explained. "He gave it to me the day before he died, when Linda was out of the room for a few minutes. He made me promise to get it to you no matter what happened at the funeral or afterward. He said it contained things he couldn't risk saying while Linda might be listening." I held the letter in my hands, feeling the texture of the paper and the slight indentations where my father's pen had pressed against the page. Opening it felt like a violation of the careful composure I had maintained throughout this impossible day, but I knew that whatever message it contained had been important enough to my father that he had risked Linda's anger to ensure its delivery. The letter was dated just 3 days before my father's death, written in handwriting that was shakier than I remembered but still unmistakably him. It began with an apology, acknowledging that he hadn't been strong enough to stand up to Linda's manipulation during his final weeks, that he had failed to protect me from the pain she was planning to inflict. He wrote about his pride in my military service, his respect for the woman I had become, and his regret that family politics had interfered with our relationship for so many years. But the most powerful part of the letter came near the end, where my father addressed the future he wouldn't be alive to influence. He wrote that he knew Linda would try to erase me from his memory, to present a version of his life that didn't include the daughter who had meant so much to him. He asked me not to let her succeed, not to allow his legacy to be rewritten by someone who had never understood what military service meant or what kind of strength it took to build something meaningful from nothing. The letter concluded with specific instructions about documents hidden in his house, evidence that would support my legal claim to his estate and expose the forgeries Linda had used to circumvent his wishes. He had anticipated her deception and had taken steps to ensure that the truth could eventually be discovered, but he needed someone who cared about his real legacy to be willing to fight for it. As I finished reading, I realized that Jimmy Rodriguez had been watching me with the patience of someone who understood the weight of what I was processing. He had carried these secrets for weeks, waiting for the right moment to share them, knowing that the information would change everything I thought I understood about my father's death and my family's betrayal. The evidence Jimmy had shown me painted a picture of systematic fraud and manipulation that went far beyond the emotional cruelty I had experienced at the memorial service. Linda hadn't just excluded me from my father's funeral, she had stolen his estate, forged legal documents, and constructed an elaborate deception designed to eliminate me from his life entirely. The scope of her betrayal was breathtaking in its audacity and thoroughness, but alongside my shock and anger, I felt something else beginning to emerge, a sense of purpose that I hadn't experienced since retiring from the military. My father had trusted me to uncover the truth and fight for justice, not just for myself but for the integrity of his memory. He had given me the tools I needed to expose Linda's deception, but it would require the same kind of courage and determination that had served me well in combat situations. Jimmy Rodriguez seemed to sense the shift in my thinking, the transition from victim to potential victor that often preceded decisive action. "Your father knew you better than Linda ever gave him credit for," he said, his voice carrying a note of pride. "He knew that once you understood what was really happening, you wouldn't let it stand. The question now is what you're going to do with this information." The choice he was offering wasn't simple or without consequences. Challenging Linda's version of events would mean exposing family secrets, creating public scandal, and potentially destroying relationships that might still be salvageable. But it would also mean honoring my father's final wishes and ensuring that his real legacy survived the woman who had tried so systematically to erase it. I looked around the diner at the ordinary people eating ordinary meals and living ordinary lives, and realized that nothing about my situation was ordinary anymore. I had been thrust into a battle I hadn't chosen, armed with weapons I hadn't known existed, fighting for stakes that went far beyond money or property. I was fighting for truth, for justice, for the memory of a man who had shaped everything I believed about honor and integrity. The decision, when it finally crystallized in my mind, felt as natural as breathing. I had spent 19 years in the military, facing down enemies and protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. This situation was different in its details, but identical in its essence. Someone was trying to destroy something valuable, and I had the power to stop that. Jimmy Rodriguez smiled when he saw the determination settle into my expression, recognizing something familiar in the way I straightened my shoulders and focused my attention. He had seen that look before, in foxholes and barracks and briefing rooms where important decisions were made under pressure. It was the look of someone who had decided to fight, regardless of the personal cost. "Welcome back to active duty, Colonel Hayes," he said quietly, and I knew that the real battle was just beginning. The law offices of Patterson and Associates occupied the third floor of a restored Victorian building in downtown Cedar Falls, the kind of place that radiated old money respectability and discretion. I had called ahead to request an emergency consultation, explaining only that I needed legal representation regarding my father's estate. The receptionist, a woman with silver hair and the bearing of someone who had seen every variety of family drama, had squeezed me into the schedule between other appointments. Marcus Chen had driven down from Cincinnati to meet me, arriving at my hotel that morning with a briefcase full of documents, and the focused intensity he brought to any mission he considered important. We had served together in Afghanistan, where his methodical approach to intelligence gathering had saved lives on more than one occasion. Now dressed in a crisp business suit instead of combat fatigues, he applied those same skills to civilian warfare. The attorney who met with us was younger than I had expected, probably in her early 40s, with sharp eyes and an air of competence that immediately inspired confidence. Margaret Patterson introduced herself as the senior partner's daughter, recently returned to Cedar Falls after practicing corporate law in Cleveland for 15 years. She listened to our story without interruption, taking notes on a legal pad and occasionally asking for clarification on specific details. When we finished laying out the evidence Jimmy Rodriguez had provided, along with Marcus's preliminary research into Linda's financial activities, Margaret sat back in her chair and studied us with the appraising look of someone calculating odds and potential outcomes. "What you're describing," she said carefully, "constitutes multiple felonies, document forgery, elder abuse, fraud, possibly conspiracy. These are serious criminal charges that could result in significant prison time." Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious. "We understand the gravity of the situation," he said, "but we also understand that Rebecca's father specifically anticipated this scenario and took steps to document what was happening. He wanted the truth to come out, and he provided the tools to make that possible." Margaret nodded slowly, then reached for her phone and pressed a button. "Sarah," she said to her assistant, "please cancel my afternoon appointments, and ask Detective Morrison if he can come in for a consultation. Tell him it involves potential elder fraud and that time may be a factor." She hung up and turned back to us. "Detective Morrison specializes in financial crimes, and has extensive experience with these types of cases. If we're going to move forward, we'll need law enforcement involvement from the beginning." The next hour passed in a blur of legal terminology and strategic planning. Margaret explained the process for challenging the validity of the revised will, the requirements for proving fraud, and the potential civil remedies available beyond criminal prosecution. She emphasized that once we initiated legal action, there would be no possibility of a quiet resolution. The case would become public record, subject to media attention and community scrutiny. Detective Morrison arrived carrying the air of someone who had seen too much human greed and deception to be surprised by anything, but as we presented our evidence, I watched his expression grow increasingly grim. He was a man in his 50s with gray hair and the patient demeanor of someone who understood that the best cases were built slowly and carefully. He examined each document with meticulous attention, asking detailed questions about chain of custody and potential witnesses. "The recording your father made is particularly valuable," he said, holding up the digital device Jimmy had entrusted to me. "Voice recognition technology can verify that it's actually your stepmother speaking, and the content clearly shows intent to defraud. Combined with the original will and the forged documents, this creates a strong foundation for prosecution." Marcus had been quiet during much of the legal discussion, but now he spoke up with the tactical precision I remembered from our military days. "What about timing?" Linda has had months to consolidate her position, transfer assets, eliminate evidence. Every day we delay gives her more opportunity to cover her track. Margaret and Detective Morrison exchanged looks that suggested they had worked together before and understood the implications of Marcus's concern. "We can move quickly," Morrison said, "but we need to be thorough. Financial crimes investigations require careful documentation, and we'll only get one chance to do this right. I'll need to interview Jimmy Rodriguez tomorrow morning to verify his testimony about the recording and the other document." The detective's phone buzzed with an incoming text message, and he glanced at it with raised eyebrows. "That's interesting," he said, looking up at us with renewed attention. "I put out some preliminary inquiries this morning after your attorney called, just routine background checks on the parties involved. It seems that Linda Hayes made some substantial bank deposits in the weeks following your father's death, amounts that don't correspond to any obvious income sources." The implication hung in the air like a challenge. Linda had moved quickly to liquidate assets, probably anticipating that someone might eventually question her authority, but in her haste, she had created exactly the kind of paper trail that experienced investigators knew how to follow. Her efficiency had become her vulnerability. Margaret picked up her legal pad and began making notes with the rapid intensity of someone formulating strategy in real time. "We'll need to file for an emergency injunction to freeze all assets until the estate can be properly administered," she said. "We'll also need to request an expedited hearing to challenge the validity of the revised will. But first, we need to serve notice on Linda and her attorney that the estate is being contested." Detective Morrison stood and gathered his materials with the deliberate movements of someone preparing for action. "I'll coordinate with the prosecutor's office to begin the criminal investigation. We'll need to move carefully to avoid any appearance of harassment, but the evidence you've provided gives us more than enough justification to proceed. Mrs. Hayes is going to have some very uncomfortable conversations in the next few days." As we prepared to leave the law office, Margaret handed me a business card and fixed me with a steady gaze. "This is going to get ugly," she warned. "Linda's not going to surrender control without a fight, and she'll probably try to paint you as a disgruntled family member seeking revenge. You need to be prepared for public scrutiny and personal attacks that go far beyond anything you've experienced so far." Marcus and I drove back to my hotel in thoughtful silence, both of us processing the magnitude of what we had set in motion. The legal machinery was now engaged, moving forward with its own inexorable momentum. There would be no going back, no possibility of a quiet family reconciliation that avoided public scandal. I had committed myself to a course of action that would either vindicate my father's memory or destroy what remained of our family relationships. That evening I called Jimmy Rodriguez to inform him about the day's developments, and to prepare him for Detective Morrison's interview. His voice carried a note of satisfaction when I described the attorney's confidence in our case, and the detective's immediate recognition of the criminal implications. "Your father would be proud," he said simply.
He always believed that the truth had a way of surfacing, even when people worked hard to bury it. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Margaret Patterson called my hotel room at 7:30, her voice tight with urgency. "Linda Hayes retained counsel yesterday afternoon," she said without preamble. "Her attorney is Thomas Brennan, one of the most expensive defense lawyers in Columbus. He's already filed a motion to dismiss any challenges to the estate as frivolous harassment. And he's requesting sanctions against us for bringing what he calls a malicious prosecution." The speed of Linda's response revealed both her guilt and her resources. She had moved from confident widow to defensive defendant in less than 24 hours, assembling a legal team that suggested she had been preparing for this confrontation longer than any of us had realized. The hiring of Thomas Brennan, known throughout Ohio for his aggressive tactics and expensive retainers, indicated that Linda was prepared to spend whatever was necessary to protect her position. But Margaret's tone suggested that Linda's rapid response had created new opportunities as well as challenges. "Brennan's motion is actually helpful to our case," she explained. "By claiming that the challenges are frivolous, he's opened the door for us to present all of our evidence in court as part of our response. He's basically given us a platform to lay out the entire case for fraud and elder abuse." Detective Morrison had arrived at the law office earlier than planned,
and Margaret put me on speaker so he could participate in the conversation. "We served the injunction freezing assets yesterday evening," he said, his voice carrying professional satisfaction. Linda's reaction was instructive. Instead of expressing confusion or asking for clarification about why this was happening, she immediately demanded to speak with her attorney. That's not the response of someone who's genuinely surprised by accusations of fraud. The detective's experience with financial crimes had taught him to read the subtle signs that distinguish genuine surprise from calculated performance. Linda's immediate resort to legal counsel, rather than attempting to resolve what an innocent person might assume was a misunderstanding, suggested consciousness of guilt that would be valuable in court proceedings. Marcus, who had been listening quietly from his chair across the hotel room, leaned toward the phone. "What about the other evidence?" he asked. "The bank records, the asset transfers, the timeline of Linda's actions after Bill's death." Morrison's response was immediate and confident. "We've subpoenaed all financial records from the relevant institutions," he said. "Based on what we've seen so far, Linda moved more than $400,000 out of accounts that should have been frozen pending proper estate administration. She also liquidated investment accounts and transferred ownership of several properties using documents that now appear to be forgeries." The scope of Linda's deception was becoming clearer with each new revelation. This wasn't simply a matter of an overreaching stepmother trying to control funeral arrangements. It was a comprehensive scheme to steal my father's entire estate, eliminate his biological daughter from any inheritance, and rewrite his legacy to serve her own financial interests. The methodical nature of her actions suggested planning that had begun long before my father's death, perhaps even before his final illness. Margaret's voice cut through my thoughts with characteristic directness. "The preliminary hearing is scheduled for Friday morning." She said. "Brennan is going to argue that Linda had legitimate authority to make all the decisions she made, based on the power of attorney and the revised will. We need to be prepared to demonstrate not just that these documents were improperly executed, but that they were part of a deliberate pattern of fraud." Jimmy Rodriguez arrived at the law office an hour later, carrying himself with the same military bearing he had displayed at the memorial service. His interview with Detective Morrison lasted nearly 3 hours, during which he provided detailed testimony about my father's mental state during his final weeks, Linda's controlling behavior, and the specific circumstances under which the recording had been made. His credibility as a witness was unassailable, his memory precise, and his motivation clearly focused on honoring his friend's wishes rather than pursuing any personal agenda. When the interview concluded, Morrison emerged from the conference room with an expression of grim satisfaction. "Rodriguez's testimony corroborates everything else we've discovered," he said. "More importantly, he can testify that your father was mentally competent when he expressed concerns about Linda's manipulation, which undermines any potential defense based on claims of confusion or incapacity." The remainder of the week passed in a whirlwind of legal preparation and strategic planning. Margaret and her team worked around the clock to organize evidence, prepare witness testimony, and anticipate the arguments Thomas Brennan would likely present. Marcus coordinated with Detective Morrison to ensure that the criminal investigation proceeded in parallel with the civil case, maximizing pressure on Linda, while avoiding any procedural conflict. Thursday evening, Margaret called to inform me that Brennan had requested a private meeting to discuss potential settlement options. His tone had changed significantly from his initial dismissive motion, suggesting that his review of our evidence had convinced him that Linda's position was weaker than she had initially claimed. The fact that he was reaching out indicated that our case had merit that even an expensive defense attorney couldn't ignore. I spent that night pacing my hotel room, rehearsing the testimony I would give the next morning and trying to prepare myself for whatever emotional manipulation Linda might attempt. She was capable of extraordinary deception, as the evidence had already demonstrated, and I knew she would use every available tool to portray herself as a grieving widow being persecuted by a resentful stepdaughter. Friday morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of sharp November air that made everything seem more vivid and immediate. I dressed in my military dress blues again, not as a costume or a gesture of defiance, but as a reminder of the values my father had instilled in me and the principles that had guided my entire adult life. The uniform represented more than military service. It represented integrity, honor, and the courage to stand up for what was right regardless of personal cost. Marcus met me in the hotel lobby, looking every inch the professional consultant in his tailored suit and confident demeanor. We walked to the courthouse together, our breath visible in the cold air, neither of us speaking but both understanding the significance of what was about to unfold. The preliminary hearing would determine whether our case had sufficient merit to proceed, but more importantly, It would provide the first public forum for presenting the truth about my father's death and Linda's systematic deception. The courthouse was a stately brick building that had served Cedar Falls for over a century, its high ceilings and polished floors echoing with the footsteps of generations of people seeking justice. As we climbed the steps to the main entrance, I caught sight of Jimmy Rodriguez waiting near the door, his presence a reminder that I wasn't fighting this battle alone. Behind him, several other veterans from the memorial service had gathered, their faces grave but supportive. Inside the courtroom, Linda sat at the defendant's table with Thomas Brennan, her appearance carefully orchestrated to project dignity and respectability. She wore a dark suit appropriate for a grieving widow, her makeup subtle but effective, her posture conveying wounded surprise rather than defensive guilt. Brennan whispered instructions in her ear, his expensive suit and confident bearing designed to intimidate opposing counsel and impress the judge. But as I took my seat at the plaintiff's table beside Margaret Patterson, I felt none of the uncertainty that had characterized my exclusion from the memorial service. I had evidence, I had allies, and most importantly, I had the truth. My father had anticipated this moment and had given me the tools I needed to fight for his real legacy. The woman who had tried to erase me from his life was about to discover that some battles are worth fighting, regardless of the personal cost. Judge Harrison entered the courtroom with the measured pace of someone who had presided over countless family disputes and understood the human capacity for both nobility and deception. He was a man in his 60s with gray hair and keen eyes that missed nothing, known throughout the county for his fairness and his intolerance for legal theatrics. As he took his seat behind the bench, I felt a surge of confidence that justice would be served, not because the system was perfect, but because the truth was powerful enough to overcome even the most sophisticated deception. The hearing that followed would determine not just the disposition of my father's estate, but the meaning of his life and the legacy he had tried so carefully to protect. Linda Hayes was about to learn that stealing from a veteran's daughter was a battle she couldn't win. The courtroom filled steadily as 9 o'clock approached, with observers taking seats in the gallery behind the bar that separated spectators from the legal proceeding. I recognized several faces from the memorial service, including veterans who had witnessed Jimmy Rodriguez's salute in the parking lot. Their presence felt like validation, a reminder that this battle was about more than money or property. It was about honoring the memory of a man who had dedicated his life to service and integrity. Margaret Patterson arranged documents on our table with practiced efficiency, each folder labeled and organized for quick reference during testimony. She moved with the confidence of someone who had prepared thoroughly for this moment, but I could see the tension in her shoulders that suggested she understood the stakes involved. This wasn't just another estate dispute. It was a test of whether the legal system could protect vulnerable people from those who would exploit their trust. Thomas Brennan cut an impressive figure at the defense table, his silver hair perfectly styled and his expensive suit projecting the kind of authority that came with decades of courtroom victory. He spoke quietly to Linda, who nodded at his instructions while maintaining the composed expression of someone who believed her performance was convincing. But I noticed the way her hands trembled slightly as she lifted her water glass, the only visible sign that her confidence might be less complete than she wanted everyone to believe. Judge Harrison called the court to order with a sharp rap of his gavel, his voice carrying clearly through the high-ceilinged room. This is a preliminary hearing in the matter of Hayes versus Hayes, regarding the estate of Colonel William Hayes. The court will hear arguments on the plaintiff's motion to invalidate the last will and testament currently on file, as well as related claims of fraud and elder abuse. Margaret rose to address the court, her opening statement delivered with the kind of controlled passion that comes from believing absolutely in the righteousness of your cause. Your Honor, she began, this case involves the systematic manipulation and financial exploitation of a dying veteran by individuals who abused his trust and forged legal documents to steal his estate. The evidence we will present today demonstrates not just civil wrongdoing, but criminal fraud of the most callous and calculated variety. Brennan's objection was immediate and forceful, his voice carrying the indignation of someone whose client had been unjustly accused. Your Honor, he declared, these allegations are nothing more than the vindictive fantasies of an estranged daughter who cannot accept that her father chose to leave his estate to the family members who actually cared for him during his final year. The plaintiff seeks to overturn legally executed documents based on speculation, hearsay, and manufactured evidence. The battle lines were drawn from the opening moments, each attorney establishing their version of events with theatrical precision. But as Margaret began presenting evidence, the strength of our case became apparent even to casual observers. She introduced the original will with its clear provisions for my inheritance, the forged documents that had replaced it, and the expert analysis that proved the signatures were fraudulent. Jimmy Rodriguez took the witness stand with military bearing, his testimony delivered in the clear, measured tones of someone accustomed to briefing superior officers. He described my father's mental acuity during their final conversations, his specific concerns about Linda's behavior, and his deliberate decision to create the recording as insurance against potential fraud. Under Margaret's questioning, Jimmy established a timeline that made Linda's claims of legitimate authority completely implausible. Brennan's cross-examination of Jimmy was aggressive but ineffective, failing to shake the old sergeant's credibility or create doubt about his motivation. Jimmy had served his country for 30 years and had no personal financial interest in the outcome of this case. His only connection was friendship with my father and a commitment to honoring a dying man's final wish. When Brennan suggested that Jimmy might be confused about dates or misremembering conversations, the witness fixed him with a steely gaze that had probably intimidated subordinates for decades. "Sir," Jimmy said with quiet dignity, "I may be old, but I'm not so. I know exactly what Colonel Hayes told me, and I know exactly why he asked me to preserve these documents. Your client manipulated a sick man, and now she's trying to profit from her deception. That's not confusion on my part. That's criminal fraud on her." The courtroom stirred at Jimmy's direct challenge to Linda's integrity, and I saw several spectators nodding in agreement. Brennan had made the tactical error of attacking a decorated veteran's credibility without having evidence to support his implication. Judge Harrison's expression suggested that the aggressive cross-examination had backfired, creating sympathy for Jimmy while casting doubt on the defense's strategy. Detective Morrison's testimony provided the financial details that transformed the case from family dispute to criminal investigation. He presented bank records showing Linda's rapid liquidation of assets after my father's death, the suspicious timing of large deposits that corresponded to property sales, and the paper trail of forged documents used to authorize transactions that exceeded her legitimate authority. His professional demeanor and methodical presentation of evidence created an atmosphere of official gravity that made Linda's actions appear not just wrong but prosecutable. When Margaret introduced the recording my father had made, the courtroom fell completely silent except for the sound of his weak but determined voice describing Linda's manipulation. Listening to him speak about his fears and his efforts to protect his real wishes was devastating, not just emotionally but legally. Here was the victim himself in his own words documenting the abuse he was experiencing, and expressing his desire to ensure that justice would eventually be served. Linda's reaction to hearing the recording was telling. Instead of appearing surprised or confused by accusations she claimed were false, she sat rigidly in her chair with her jaw clenched and her eyes focused on the table in front of her. Her body language suggested someone who recognized damaging evidence, rather than someone hearing shocking revelations for the first time. Even her attorney seemed shaken by the recording's content and the obvious authenticity of my father's voice. Brennan's case began to unravel during his presentation of Linda's defense. He argued that she had acted within her authority as my father's wife and medical power of attorney, making decisions that any reasonable person would have made under the circumstances. But when Margaret cross-examined Linda herself, the carefully constructed facade began to crumble under sustained questioning. Linda's testimony revealed inconsistencies in her story that became more apparent with each question. She claimed not to remember specific conversations that were documented in the recording. She couldn't explain why she had moved so quickly to liquidate assets, if she had been acting in good faith. Most damaging, she couldn't provide a coherent explanation for why my father would have wanted to exclude his military daughter from a memorial service, celebrating his own military career. Under Margaret's relentless questioning, Linda's composure finally shattered. Her voice rose defensively as she insisted that everything she had done was motivated by love for my father and concern for his memory. She claimed that I had abandoned him years earlier, that I had never shown proper respect for the family he had built with her, and that my sudden appearance during his final illness had been motivated by greed rather than genuine affection. But Margaret was ready for these attacks, presenting evidence of my regular communication with my father, the letters he had written expressing pride in my military service, and the specific provisions in his original will that demonstrated his desire to include me in his legacy. Linda's attempt to portray me as an estranged daughter seeking undeserved inheritance collapsed in the face of documented evidence of our continued relationship and his clear intentions for my inheritance. The turning point came when Margaret played a portion of the recording that Linda apparently hadn't remembered clearly. In it, my father's voice could be heard asking Linda directly why she was so determined to exclude Rebecca from the funeral arrangement. Linda's recorded response was chillingly honest, because she's not really part of this family, and it's time people understood that. The silence that followed this revelation was deafening, broken only by the sound of several spectators drawing sharp breaths. Judge Harrison's expression throughout the hearing had remained professionally neutral, but but the cumulative weight of evidence was clearly affecting his evaluation of the case. When both sides had finished presenting their arguments, he called for a brief recess to review the materials before rendering his decision. The 15-minute break felt like an eternity, during which Linda huddled with her attorney while I tried to maintain composure despite the emotional exhaustion of reliving my father's death and betrayal. When court reconvened, Judge Harrison's voice carried the authority of someone who had seen enough evidence to reach a clear conclusion. After reviewing the testimony and evidence presented today, he said, "I find that there is substantial evidence of fraud, elder abuse, and document forgery. The will currently on file with this court is hereby declared invalid, and the original will dated 2 years prior is restored as the controlling document for the administration of Colonel Hayes's estate." The judge continued with orders that sent shockwaves through Linda's carefully constructed world. All assets transferred after Colonel Hayes's death are to be frozen pending full investigation by law enforcement. Ms. Linda Hayes is hereby removed as executor of the estate and is enjoined from disposing of any property or assets that belong to the deceased. Colonel Rebecca Hayes is appointed as the rightful executor, with full authority to administer her father's estate according to his documented wish. Linda's face went ashen as the full implications of the judge's ruling became clear. Not only had she lost control of my father's estate, but the court had essentially endorsed the criminal investigation that would likely result in felony charges. Brennan leaned over to whisper urgently in her ear, probably advising her about the Fifth Amendment rights she would need to exercise in future proceedings. But Judge Harrison wasn't finished. "The court finds the evidence of deliberate deception and manipulation particularly disturbing," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of moral judgment alongside legal authority. "Colonel Hayes served his country with distinction for decades, and he deserved to have his final wishes respected rather than manipulated for financial gain. This court will not tolerate the abuse of elderly veterans, regardless of the relationship between the perpetrator and victim." The judge's final order addressed the memorial service that had started this entire ordeal. Given that the original funeral arrangements did not reflect Colonel Hayes's documented wishes, he ruled, "The court hereby orders that a proper military memorial service be conducted within 30 days, with full honors and recognition of his service and his pride in his daughter's military career. The costs of this service will be charged to the estate, and Mrs. Linda Hayes is enjoined from interfering with the arrangements in any way." As the gavel fell and court adjourned, I felt a complex mixture of emotions that defied simple categorization. There was relief, certainly, that my father's wishes would finally be honored and that Linda's deception had been exposed. There was satisfaction that the legal system had worked as it should, protecting the vulnerable and punishing those who would exploit them. But there was also sadness that it had taken a public courtroom battle to achieve what should have been accomplished through basic family decency and respect. Linda gathered her things with shaking hands, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the courtroom as she prepared to leave with Brent. Her world had collapsed in the span of a single morning. The carefully constructed lies that had supported her comfortable life exposed as the fraudulent schemes they had always been. Tyler and Amber, who had attended the hearing, looked stunned and confused as they began to understand the implications of their mother's actions. Jimmy Rodriguez approached me as the courtroom emptied, his weathered face showing the satisfaction of a mission completed successfully. "Your father would be proud," he said simply. "You fought for the truth and the truth won. That's all any soldier can ask for in the end." His words carried the weight of shared values and mutual respect, a reminder that some bonds transcend family relationships and are based instead on character and integrity. The weeks that followed brought a steady stream of legal and practical details that needed attention as I worked to properly administer my father's estate. Detective Morrison's criminal investigation resulted in felony charges against Linda for fraud, elder abuse, and forgery. She eventually accepted a plea agreement that included restitution, probation, and community service, avoiding prison time but ensuring that her criminal conduct became part of the public record. The memorial service ordered by the court took place on a crisp December morning at the Cedar Falls Veterans Memorial with full military honors provided by the Honor Guard from nearby Fort Morris. Jimmy Rodriguez delivered a eulogy that captured my father's character and values with the eloquence of someone who had shared foxholes and friendships that transcended ordinary relationships. I spoke about the lessons he had taught me and the pride he had taken in my military service. Words that should have been spoken at his original funeral but were no less meaningful for their delayed delivery. The turnout for the corrected memorial service was remarkable, with veterans from multiple generations gathering to honor a man whose integrity had inspired respect across decades of service and community involvement. Linda did not attend, having moved to Florida to stay with relatives while her legal troubles were resolved. Tyler and Amber remained in Ohio but kept their distance from the proceedings, probably still processing the revelation that their mother was a convicted criminal. In the months that followed, I made the decision to relocate to Cedar Falls permanently, taking early retirement from my consulting work in Portland to focus on managing my father's business interests and contributing to the veteran community he had served so faithfully. The hardware store that bore his name became profitable again under proper management, and I established a scholarship fund for military children that reflected his values and priorities. The house on Maple Street, which had been Linda's domain during her marriage to my father, was sold and the proceeds donated to veteran support organizations. I found a smaller place closer to downtown, within walking distance of the memorial park where my father's name was finally added to the wall of honor that commemorated local heroes. Sometimes I visit that wall in the evening, when the crowds have gone home and the setting sun illuminates the engraved names of men and women who understood that some things are worth fighting for. The legal victory provided vindication and justice, but the deeper healing came through rebuilding connections with the community my father had loved and served. Veterans who had known him sought me out to share memories and stories that painted a fuller picture of the man he had been outside of family relationships. I learned about his quiet generosity, his mentorship of younger veterans, and his reputation for integrity that had made the fraud against him particularly shocking to those who knew him well. Jimmy Rodriguez became a close friend and advisor, his wisdom and perspective helping me navigate the complex emotions of grief, justice, and forgiveness. We met regularly for coffee at Murphy's Diner, where he shared stories about my father's military service that filled gaps in my understanding of the man who had shaped my own commitment to duty and honor. Through these conversations, I began to understand that my father's greatest legacy wasn't the money or property he had left behind, but the values he had instilled and the example he had set. The experience taught me that family isn't always defined by blood relationships, but by the people who stand with you when integrity and justice are at stake. Linda's biological children had abandoned me when their mother's fraud was exposed, but veterans who barely knew me had rallied to support the truth and honor my father's memory. Jimmy Rodriguez, Marcus Chen, and the lawyers and investigators who had fought for justice became my real family, bound together by shared values rather than shared genetics. Sometimes people ask me if I regret pursuing the legal battle, if the public exposure and family conflict were worth the vindication I achieved. The answer is always the same. My father trusted me to fight for his memory and his wishes, and I couldn't let him down. The woman who tried to erase me from his life discovered that some bonds are stronger than deception, some truths are more powerful than lies, and some fights are worth having regardless of the personal cost. Today, when I walk through downtown Cedar Falls or attend community events at the Veterans Memorial, I'm no longer the excluded daughter standing in a parking lot while others celebrate my father's life. I'm Colonel Rebecca Hayes, carrying forward his legacy of service and integrity, ensuring that his values continue to influence the community he loved. Linda Hayes thought she could rewrite his story to serve her own purposes, but she learned that the truth has a way of surfacing, even when people work hard to bury it. The memorial service that started this journey taught me that honor isn't something that can be granted or taken away by others. It's something you earn through your choices and defend through your actions. My father earned his honor through decades of service, and I earned mine by refusing to let his memory be distorted by someone who never understood what he really stood for. That's a lesson worth fighting for, and a legacy worth preserving. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.